The great, slow-moving ships of the gathered peoples drifted into the Pyeongtaek field. It was a messy place. Rocks and metal and ice from 2 broken moons cluttered the space between 3 stars. It was a quiet place for many years. Now it was not quiet. First Voice, the chief technologist, watched the main screen. The view showed a small human ship. It was called a diplomatic cutter. It was smooth and white. A young human woman named Lee was on that ship. She was speaking to the Council of the Gathered Peoples over a video link. "Esteemed Council," Lee said. Her voice was translated into soft, musical tones. "We thank you for this meeting. The object you see on your deep scans, the one you call Debris Mass 771, is of interest to us. It is a human vessel. Its name was the CNS Busan." On another screen, First Voice called up the scan. The object was dark and cold, tumbled slowly. The shape was wrong. One side was longer than the other. Parts of it looked like they were added on later. It had many scars from old battles. It was a thing of violence and haste. To the gathered peoples who built their ships to be perfect and balanced, it was an ugly thing. "We believe it was lost here over 20 years ago," Lee continued. "It was part of a conflict we call the Asteroid War. That war is over. We have peace now. We wish to build trust with the gathered peoples. So we offer you the Busan. You may take it, study it, learn from it. We ask only for a liaison officer to observe, to answer your questions about its human origins." On the command deck of the research vessel Clarion, First Voice felt a ripple of interest from the other scientists. A real human warship, and so old, it would be like a history lesson. They could learn how humans thought, how they built things. It would help them understand this new, loud species that had just joined the galactic community. The humans seemed emotional and disorderly. Studying this broken ship would explain why. The council agreed quickly. It was a generous gift. The humans' terms were simple. A small team, led by First Voice, would secure the derelict and bring it to a research station. A human observer would be allowed. The operation took several days. Tractor beams caught the tumbling wreck. Heavy cables were attached. The Busan was a heavy thing, a dense knot of metal. It did not look like it could fly fast. It did not look elegant. But it looked strong. As the tug ships pulled it, First Voice noted how thick the hull was in some places, and surprisingly thin in others. It made no logical sense. The human liaison officer arrived on the Clarion. His name was Min. He was an engineer. He was quiet. He wore a simple gray uniform. He did not smile with his mouth, but his eyes were watchful. He stood very still. First Voice approached him. "You are welcome, Min. We are grateful for your people's gift. We look forward to understanding this artifact." Min gave a small nod. "Thank you. It is an honor." His voice was flat. "You served on ships like this?" First Voice asked. "For a time. Long ago," Min said. He looked past First Voice at the main screen, which now showed a close-up of the Busan's battered hull. His eyes moved over the scars, the patched-up holes, the faded paint that might have once been a flag. He knew this ship. Not this exact one, but its kind. He knew the sounds it would have made, the smell of its air, the feel of its deck underfoot. "Can you tell us about its design philosophy?" First Voice asked. "It seems irregular." Min was silent for a moment. "It was built during a war," he said finally. "The shipyards were busy. Materials were short. They used what was there. They changed plans when parts did not arrive." First Voice processed this. To build a warship without the perfect materials. To change the design halfway? It was unthinkable. It was like building a musical instrument with wrong-sized pipes. How could it function? "The crew must have found it difficult," First Voice said. "To serve on a ship that was not optimal." A very strange look passed over Min's face. It was not sadness and it was not anger. It was something harder to name. "They made it work," he said, his voice low. "They always made it work." The Busan was secured in the giant research hangar. The scientists of the gathered peoples floated around it in their pods, their scanners glowing. They chattered with excitement. They saw a puzzle to solve. primitive, simple puzzle. Min stood at the observation window alone. He watched the small lights dance over the dark, silent shape of his old world. He did not see a puzzle. He saw a story written in weld marks and patch jobs. He knew what the aliens would find. He had been ordered not to interfere, not to explain, just to observe. Lee's voice played in his memory from their final briefing. Let them look, Min. Let them see. True understanding cannot be given. It must be discovered. First voice joined him at the window, feeling pleased. A fascinating specimen. We will start with the outer hull tomorrow. We will map every imperfection. Min nodded slowly, his eyes still fixed on the ship. Yes, he whispered almost to himself. Start with the hull. That is a good place. He knew the truth was not in the perfect, beautiful ships the gathered people sailed in now. The truth was hidden here, in this ugly, broken thing. The truth was in why it was ugly, and why, despite being broken, it had lasted so long in the cold dark. He waited for the aliens to begin their lesson, the most terrifying lesson they would ever learn. The research bay was bright and silent. The only sounds were the soft hum of machines and the gentle clicks of scanning tools. The alien scientists worked with calm efficiency. They moved in their floating pods around the massive, dark shape of the human warship. First voice felt a growing sense of confusion. The initial scans were complete. The data made no sense. He floated near the nose of the ship. His pod scanners showed the hull composition. It was not one thing. It was many things. The primary armor was a decent titanium alloy. But right next to it was a plate of simple steel. And next to that, a patch of something that looked like recycled cargo container metal. The lines between the materials were rough, like the work was done in a hurry. This is illogical, First voice said to his assistant, a young technologist named Kale. A warship's hull must have uniform strength. A weak point can be exploited. Why would they build in weak points on purpose? Kale checked his own screen. Perhaps they are not intelligent enough to know this? First voice was not sure. He moved his pod along the ship's side. The scarring was intense. Here was a deep gash from a particle beam. But the gash was not repaired with the same alloy. It was sealed with a cheaper, lighter composite. It was like healing a broken bone with clay. He saw the markings. Near each patch, there were human symbols painted by hand. He had asked Min about them earlier. They are maintenance markings, Min had said. The crew marked what was done, and when. But the materials are different every time, First voice had pressed. Min had just looked at him. You use what you have, not what you wish to have. Now, looking at the patchwork hull, First voice began to understand the words. This ship was not built once. It was rebuilt many times. Every scar represented a failure. Every patch was a solution made under pressure. The ship was a record of its own survival. The confusion deepened inside the ship. First voice led a team through a main airlock. The doors were thick, but they opened manually with a large wheel. The aliens had to turn it with effort. Their own doors opened with a soft sound. This door groaned. Inside, the corridors were narrow and dark. The lights were off. The aliens used their own floating lights. The air was cold and still. It smelled of old metal and something else. Something organic and faint, like oil and old sweat. The wiring was the next shock. Cables ran along the walls in open trays. They were not all the same color or size. In one section, a thick black cable was spliced into two thinner red ones. The splice was wrapped in a strange, sticky tape. In another place, a bundle of wires was routed straight through a hole drilled in a metal beam. The edges of the hole were rough. It was not a planned conduit. It was a shortcut. Look here, Kale said, his voice uneasy. He pointed his light at a junction box. 4 different types of connectors were linked together by a handmade adapter. It was made of polished scrap metal. This should not work. The power flow would be uneven. It would cause system errors. But the ship's logs show it did work, First voice said quietly. He checked the datapad in his pod. The last known status of the ship's power grid was nominal. This messy, ugly knot of wires had provided energy to the whole forward section. They moved to the engine room. The reactors were cold and dead. But around them, the story was the same. Pipes were not symmetrical. Extra valves were added in strange places. A large pump was mounted on a frame that was clearly made later, welded right onto the main deck. One of the younger scientists, fascinated, spoke up. "It is creative. They solved problems as they appeared." First Voice felt a chill. This was not creativity. This was desperation. This was a scream frozen in metal and wire. Every non-standard part, every patch, every ugly splice was a moment of crisis. A moment where something broke, and a human found a way to make it work again, just enough, just for a little longer. He thought of the ships of the gathered peoples. If a conduit was damaged, the whole system shut down safely. You replaced the part with an identical one. It was perfect, clean, and logical. A human ship, it seemed, would never shut down. It would just get uglier and more complicated. He found Min in the observation room, looking at the live feed from inside the ship. Min's face was blank. "Your engineers," First Voice began, choosing his words. "They did not follow the original plans. The original plans were for a ship built in a peaceful yard," Min said, his eyes on the screen showing the messy engine room. "This ship lived in a war. The plans changed. But the inefficiency, the risk, it is overwhelming." Min finally turned to look at him. "What is the risk? The risk of the system being ugly, or the risk of the system stopping?" "Stopping, of course," First Voice said. "A stopped ship is a dead ship." Min nodded slowly. "Yes, a stopped ship is a dead ship. So the system must not stop. Ever. No matter how it looks." He turned back to the screen. First Voice followed his gaze. The floating lights of the alien scientists moved over the chaotic wiring like confused fireflies. They were looking for the blueprint, the perfect design. They would not find it. The blueprint was in the minds of the dead crew. It was a simple, terrifying rule. Keep going. First Voice left the observation room. The quiet order of his research bay felt different now. The perfectly calibrated tools, the identical pods, the logical procedures. It all felt fragile. He looked at the dark, patchwork hull of the human ship. It was not fragile. It was ugly and wrong, and it had survived things his beautiful ships never could. He felt the first cold trickle of fear. They were not studying a less advanced technology. They were studying a different kind of logic. A logic that valued survival over perfection. And he did not know how to measure that or where its limits were. The focus shifted from the ship's bones to its mind. First Voice and his team now worked in the main computer core. The room was tight and cold. The central processing units were simple, solid blocks. They were not the elegant, glowing crystals of the gathered people's technology. They were old and boxy. The real puzzle was not the hardware. It was the software, the ship's operating system. It took days to bypass the security. It was not a clever lock. It was just layers of old, conflicting codes and manual overrides. Finally, the main screens in the research bay flickered to life with human text and symbols. First Voice expected order. A main menu. A clear map of systems. Navigation, weapons, life support, communications. Clean lines of code. That is not what he found. He called up the life support system. The code was a mess. The original programming was there, but it was buried under thousands of lines of added instructions. Notes from engineers were written directly into the code. He had the translation software read one. Asterisk, by Chief Engineer Tay. Date August 14, 2147. CO2 scrubber bank C is dead. Diverted airflow through secondary bypass in junction 7G. Do not use setting auto-regulate. Use manual control from station B2. See addendum log for valve sequence. Asterisk. First Voice pulled up the schematic for junction 7G. It was not a life support junction. It was part of the coolant system for the laser batteries. The humans had connected their air to their weapons cooling lines. Kale stared at the screen. That would reduce the cooling for the lasers. It would also make the air smell strange. Yes, First Voice said. His voice was quiet, but the air would be breathable, and the lasers would still work, just not as long. He looked for the weapons system next. It was worse. The primary firing controls for the ship's main railgun were marked with a red digital flag. The translation read, "Corrupted, do not engage." But the railgun had been fired in the final battle logs. How? Scrolling down, he found the answer. A junior weapons officer, someone named Yuna, had written a patch. She had routed the firing command through the ship's damage control network. To fire the main gun, you had to go to a different station entirely, input a series of commands meant for sealing hull breaches, and then hold 2 physical buttons at the same time. It was insane. It was a Rube Goldberg machine made of code. "This is not a system," Kale whispered. "This is a collection of fixes." "That is the system," a voice said from the doorway. It was Min. He walked in, his hands behind his back. He looked at the lines of code on the screen. He showed no surprise. First voice turned to him. "This is chaos, Min. Your crew had to remember 100 strange steps just to do simple things. A wrong step could kill everyone." Min nodded. "Yes, so they trained. They drilled. Every day. They drilled the new steps. Until it was normal." Normal? First voice could not hide his disbelief. To use damage control to fire a weapon? That is not normal. That is a failure. Min stepped closer to the screen. He pointed at the code for the life support bypass. "You see this as a failure. The scrubber failed." "That is true." But Engineer Tay did not see a failure. He saw a problem. The problem was, people need air. He found air. In the weapons coolant line. He made a new system. A worse system, but a working system. He turned to face First Voice. His eyes were calm and hard. "Your ships are perfect. If a scrubber fails, does your ship find air in the coolant line?" "Of course not," First Voice said. "The system would seal the deck. It would keep the problem contained. It is safe. It is logical. It is death," Min said simply. "For the people on that deck. Their problem is not contained. It is solved. They are dead." He looked back at the screen. On the Busan, a problem was never contained. It was always shared. The whole ship shared every problem. If the guns lost cooling, life support suffered. If life support failed, the gun crews worked in masks. There was no their problem and my problem. There was only our problem. And our problem had to be fixed right now with whatever was nearby. The room was silent. The aliens understood the words, but the meaning was a cold stone in their stomachs. First Voice imagined it. On his ship, a failure in one module meant that module was safely locked away. It was clean. On this human ship, a failure would spread like a virus through the whole vessel. It would force weird connections. It would make the ship sick, but it would keep it alive. A sick, twisted, but living thing. He called up another file. It was a simple maintenance log. A crewman named Jean had written it. Asterisk rerouted Port 02 through coolant line 3B. Efficiency down 40%. But it works. Don't switch the red toggle. Asterisk. First Voice read the last sentence again. But it works. Not, it is optimal. Not, it is correct. Just it works. That was the core of it. The human doctrine was not about things being right. It was about things working. However badly. However strangely. However dangerously. He looked from the lines of code to the dark, silent hull visible through the research bay window. The patchwork metal. The ugly welds. The weird wiring. It was all the same idea. A desperate, brutal determination to simply not stop. Perfection was a luxury. A luxury the humans, in their dark little war, could not afford. They had traded it for something else. Something that looked like madness. But something that had kept this ugly ship flying long after a perfect ship would have shut down and died. First Voice felt a deep unease. He was beginning to see the shape of the human mind. It was not a clean, logical shape. It was a tangled knot. A knot that refused to be cut. The damaged black boxes of the Busan yielded their final secrets. They were not perfect records. The data was broken, full of gaps and static. The gathered people's technicians worked to clean it up, to put the pieces in order. They began to watch the logs of the ship's final months. They were not looking at systems anymore. They were looking at faces, people. First Voice watched on the main screen. The footage was grainy. It showed the ship's mess hall. It was crowded and loud. Humans were talking, eating, some were laughing. Their uniforms were not all the same. Some were clean. Some were stained with oil or dirt. They looked tired. Then a loud alarm blared. A red light flashed on the screen. The reaction was instant. The laughter stopped. But there was no panic. The humans stood up. They moved quickly, but not in a run. They left their food. They went to the doors. The log skipped. Now it showed a different place. A corridor filled with smoke. The camera shook. An alarm was screaming. A young woman, her face covered in soot, was kneeling by a broken pipe. Steam was shooting out. She was not an engineer. Her uniform patch identified her as a communications officer. Her name was Era, but she was not fixing a communication device. She was using a metal clamp and a piece of heavy fabric to seal the pipe. She worked with focused hands. Another crewman, a man named Hoon from logistics, held a light for her. He was shouting numbers about pressure levels to her. The log skipped again. The medical bay. It was full. Beds were on the floor. A man with a medic symbol on his arm was setting a broken bone. But next to him, a weapons officer was holding an 4-bag high. And next to her, a junior pilot was mopping up water from a leaking ceiling pipe. First Voice felt a deep wrongness. It was the wrongness of broken categories. A communicator should communicate. A logistics officer should manage supplies. A medic should heal. Here, they were all doing everything. They had swapped roles. They are not in their assigned positions, Kale said, confused. This is inefficient. They are not trained for these tasks. Min was watching from the back of the room. He spoke softly. They were trained on the job. In that moment. But the risk of error, First Voice started. The risk of doing nothing was death, Min interrupted. His voice was flat. Era in communications saw a broken steam pipe. She did not say, I am not a pipe specialist. She said, the pipe is broken. I have 2 hands. She fixed it. Maybe not well, but she fixed it enough. The logs continued. They showed the bridge during an attack. The main lights were out. Only emergency lights glowed. The captain was gone. A young officer named Sue was in the command chair. Her console was mostly dead. She was holding 2 damaged wires together with her bare hands, creating a connection. She was shouting commands to the engine room through a handheld radio. Her official role was navigation. The chain of command, First Voice whispered. It was gone. The hierarchy had melted. In its place was a flat, desperate network. Whoever could do a thing did the thing. The most chilling log was the shortest. It was audio only. Heavy breathing. The sound of tools. And 2 voices. Voice 1. Strained. Gene, the circuit is fried. I can't reroute it. Voice 2. Calm. Give me the housing. The good chip from the entertainment system in Crew Lounge 4. It's the same type. I checked. Voice 1. That's for the crew's music and videos. Voice 2. Gene. They don't need music. They need thruster control. Get it. A long pause. Then the sound of a successful power hum. First Voice turned off the log. The room was very quiet. The principle was now clear, and it was terrifying. On a ship of the gathered peoples, every person was a single, perfect tool. A scanner technician was a scanner technician. His mind, his training, his entire purpose was to scan. If the scanner broke, he waited for a repair technician. He did not become a repair technician. That was not his function. To ask him to do so would be cruel, like asking a hearing device to see. On the human ship, every person was a multi-tool. And when a specialized tool broke, the multi-tools would swarm over the problem. They would hack, adapt, and jury-rig. They would lose efficiency, but they would not lose function. First Voice looked at Min. Your people. They have no true specialization? We have specialization, Min corrected him quietly. But it is a starting point, not a cage. On a long mission in a war, cages get you killed. So we learn the edges of each other's jobs. The engineer learns basic medicine. The medic learns how to reset a power relay. The pilot learns how to cook. It is how we live. It is how we live. The words hung in the air. First Voice finally understood the panic rising in his chest. It was not about the ship. It was about the species. To fight the gathered peoples, you would target their specialists. Remove their scanner technicians and their vision goes blind. Remove their engineers and their ships become static. To fight humans? How do you fight them? If you target their engineers, their medics will try to fix the engines. If you target their pilots, their cooks might try to fly. You cannot break their system by removing a part, because the parts are all slightly interchangeable. They are a swarm, not a machine. You cannot stop a swarm by removing one bee. It just reforms. The Busan was not a crew of 70 individuals. It was one organism with 70 hands. And you could cut off 20 of those hands, and the organism would pick things up with its feet. It would be ugly. It would be clumsy. But it would not stop. First Voice left the room. He needed to be away from the screens, from the ghostly voices of the dead, adaptable humans. He went to the observation window. The Busan sat there, silent and dark. It no longer looked primitive. It looked like a carcass. The carcass of a beast that was too stubborn to die the right way. A beast that would bite with whatever teeth it had left. He had learned the second human rule. The first was, keep going. The second was, anyone can help. Together they formed a nightmare of relentless, messy, shared survival. The final piece was the most damaged. It was the heart of the ship's violence, the primary weapons control nexus. The room was a disaster. A direct hit had torn through the ceiling. It was blackened by fire and frozen by the vacuum of space. The elegant control chairs were melted lumps. First Voice floated in his pod, surveying the ruin. His team had mapped the rest of the ship's strange logic. The patchwork hull, the chaotic software, the adaptable crew. It was a frightening picture, but it was still a picture of a ship, a transport, a life pod. But this room was different. This was where the ship became a weapon. And weapons had to be precise. They had to be reliable. A gun that might or might not fire was worse than no gun at all. He expected to find nothing here but broken parts. Proof that even human improvisation had limits. Kale was scanning the main console. It was dead. Its systems were fused into a solid, blackened mass. Primary control is completely destroyed, Kale reported. No recovery possible. The ship's main weapons were offline at the end. First Voice was about to agree. It made sense. This was a clean, understandable failure. Then a junior technician, a female named Ellen, spoke from a corner. Her voice was puzzled. But the battle log data, it shows the point defense network was active until the final second. It even registered kills. First Voice turned. That is not possible. The point defense system was slaved to this nexus. No primary control, no secondary fire. Perhaps they had a backup system? Kale offered. They began to search. They followed the heavy power cables that led from the ruined nexus. The cables did not end at the ruin. They were severed, yes, but the ends were not just cut. They were carefully stripped, and from them new, smaller wires snaked out across the floor. The team followed this handmade trail. It led them out of the weapons nexus. It went down a damaged corridor. It turned into a small secondary room. It was a damage control staging area, a place for storing tools and patches for hull breaches. In the center of this small, dirty room were 3 stations. They were not weapon stations. They were simple engineering terminals for controlling internal airlocks and power reroutes. But they had been changed. Someone had physically opened the panels of these 3 stations. They had hardwired the severed cables from the weapons nexus directly into their systems. They had bypassed miles of optical data cable and control relays. They had made a direct, brutal connection. On each of the 3 terminals, a crude manual aiming interface had been programmed. It was just a joystick and a firing button. A small screen showed a basic camera view from the ship's outer hull. First voice stared. He understood. When the main weapons control was destroyed, the humans did not lose their point defense guns. They did something else. They turned 3 random damage control stations into manual gun turret controls. He pulled up the final battle log on his datapad. He synced it with the location. The log showed a swarm of enemy fighter craft. The Busan's automated point defense was gone. Then, a few seconds later, the guns started firing again. Not in the precise, sweeping patterns of a computer. In short, jerky bursts. In 3 separate, uncoordinated fields of fire. 3 crewmen, sitting in this dirty tool room, were manually aiming and shooting the ship's defensive guns. Like playing a violent video game. But with real lives, real lasers, and a real ship shaking around them. The coordination. Kale breathed, horrified. They would have no overall picture. They could shoot at each other's targets. They could miss whole sections of the ship. Yes, First Voice said, his voice hollow. They would be inefficient. They would waste power. They would make errors. He looked at the makeshift setup. The soldering was rough. The code was simple. It was a child's version of a weapons system. But it had worked. The battle log confirmed kills. This jury-rigged, stupid, clumsy system had kept the enemy fighters at bay. For a little while. Long enough. That was the final, crushing revelation. The horror was not in the power of human weapons. It was in their redundancy. Not the clean, built-in redundancy of his people's ships. This was a savage redundancy. Human redundancy did not mean a backup system. It meant that any system could be turned into a backup for any other system. If the weapon control broke, you could use the damage control stations. If those broke, could you use the navigation console? The kitchen oven? Where did it end? For the gathered peoples, a thing had one purpose. A weapon control was for weapons. A damage control station was for damage. The lines were clear. The universe was orderly. For the humans, a thing had its purpose, and then it had 100 other possible purposes if you were brave enough and desperate enough to rewire it. Their universe was fluid. It was chaotic. First Voice saw the tactical nightmare. You fight a human ship. You carefully target its weapons control. You destroy it. You think, good. It is toothless now. But it is not toothless. It is just angry and creative. Now its guns are being fired by someone in the laundry room. You target the engines. They are being run from the medical bay. You target the bridge. Command shifts to the mess hall. You cannot disarm them. You can only completely, utterly vaporize them. Every last bolt. Because any piece left might be turned into a weapon. He turned away from the makeshift gun controls. He felt cold. The panic was no longer a trickle. It was a flood. He had found the core of the human war machine. It was not a place on the ship. It was an idea. An idea that said, if it exists, it can be made to fight. And that idea lived in every human mind. Min was waiting outside the damaged control nexus, as if he knew what they had found. His face was unreadable. First Voice floated up to him. His voice was a whisper. The knowledge. It strikes panic into me, Min. Min met his gaze. He gave a slow, small nod. It was not a nod of victory. It was a nod of understanding. He knew the fear he was seeing. The lesson is learned, Min said quietly. A ship is just a tool. Our real weapon is our willingness to use anything as a tool. Even our own failure. First Voice looked past him. Back into the research bay where his beautiful, logical, fragile ships hovered. He had never felt so unsafe. First Voice stood before the council. The chamber was a vast, quiet sphere. The air was clean and still. Soft light glowed from the walls. The counselors of the gathered peoples floated in their places. They were calm. They expected a technical report. A curiosity. First Voice's own calm was gone. His voice did not have its usual musical tone. It was flat and dry. We have completed the examination of the human vessel Busan, he began. A senior counselor, an old being with slow-moving fronds, gestured peace. Tell us of its primitive systems. Does it confirm their lack of advancement? First Voice felt a tightness in his chest. No, it does not. They are advanced. But in a different direction. A direction we do not understand. A direction that is dangerous. He activated the display sphere in the center of the chamber. He did not show them pictures of patchy hulls or messy wires. He showed them the principles. He showed two ships. One, a beautiful vessel of the gathered peoples. It was smooth and perfect. Arrows pointed to its systems. Navigation, weapons, life support, engines. Each system was in its own box. Lines connected them, but the lines were neat and few. Our ship, first voice said. A system of order. A failure in one system is contained. It is safe. It is predictable. Then he showed the human ship. It was the ugly, blocky shape of the Busan. But inside he did not draw boxes. He drew a wild, tangled web. Lines went everywhere. Navigation connected to weapons. Weapons connected to life support. Life support connected to the mess hall. Every part was linked to every other part in a confusing knot. Their ship, he said, his voice dropping. A failure in one system is not contained. It spreads. It forces new connections. It makes the ship change. It becomes a new, different, functional thing. A sick thing. But a living thing. The counselors were silent. They were listening. First voice showed them the data from the weapons nexus. The image of the 3 damage control stations rewired into gun controls. He showed the logs of the medic holding an 4-bag, the communicator fixing a steam pipe. They have no fixed roles, he explained. A person is not a function. Person is a possibility. In a crisis, any human can become any other needed function. At a lower skill. With great risk. But they can. An older counselor spoke, her voice gentle with disbelief. This seems merely inefficient and chaotic. It is a weakness. They would burn out. They would make fatal errors. They do make errors, first voice agreed. They die. But the system does not die. The ship does not stop. You cannot kill it by removing a part. Because the parts change jobs. You cannot make it helpless by destroying its weapons control. Because its laundry room becomes weapons control. He paused. The chamber was very quiet. Think of a conflict, he said, choosing his words with care. You face their fleet. Your strategy is perfect. You identify their command ship. You destroy its bridge. In our world, that ship is dead. It is a floating hull. This battle is over. He changed the display. It showed a human command ship, its bridge a smoking ruin. In their world, first voice continued, the battle is not over. Command shifts to the engine room. You target the engine room. Command shifts to the medical bay. You target their communications array. They start using flashlights to signal each other. You are not fighting a machine. You are fighting a liquid. You try to grab it, and it flows through your fingers and forms a new shape behind you. To stop it, you must boil away every single drop. There is no partial victory, only total destruction or defeat. A cold understanding began to settle in the chamber. It was not a fear of power. It was a fear of nature. They were looking at a new kind of predator, one that could not be cleanly hunted. What is their weakness? Another counselor asked. First voice looked down. We have not found one. Their weakness is their strength. They are chaotic. They are unpredictable. They are willing to do anything, use anything, become anything to continue. They do not have a point of failure. They have 1,000 points of minor failure, and each one just makes them stranger and more dangerous. He closed the displays. The sphere went dark. The human Min said it best. First voice finished, his voice barely a whisper now. He said their real weapon is the willingness to use anything as a tool, even failure. How do you plan for an enemy whose primary strategy is to become a new, more dangerous problem the moment you try to solve them? The question hung in the perfect, clean air of the council sphere. There was no answer. The counselors looked at each other. The quiet was no longer peaceful. It was the quiet of dread. They had asked for a report on a tool. They had been given a report on a virus that learned, adapted, and used its own sickness as a weapon. First voice was dismissed. He floated out of the chamber. The panic was no longer just his. It was in the air. It was in the quiet whispers that began as soon as the doors closed behind him. They had studied the human warship. They had acquired knowledge. And the knowledge was a key that unlocked a door. And on the other side of that door was a dark, endless ocean of uncertainty. An ocean where all their perfect, logical rules of war did not apply. They had wanted to understand humanity. Now they did. And the understanding was a chilling wind that swept through their orderly galaxy. Diplomat Lee was called before the full council. She entered the great sphere alone. The quiet felt heavy now, like a blanket made of lead. The faces of the counselors were no longer just curious. They were watchful. They were afraid. She stood in the center, her hands folded. She wore a simple gray suit. She did not look like a threat. She looked calm. The senior counselor with the fronds spoke first. His voice was old and tired. Diplomat Lee, your gift has been instructive. Your officer, Min, has been helpful. But we have questions. The design of your ship, the behavior of your crew, it reveals a mindset of chaos and desperation. It is not a mindset of a peaceful species. Lee nodded slowly. She did not argue. The Busan was born in war. It reflects that time. But the mindset, as you call it, was not born in war. It was merely revealed there. Explain, said another counselor, her tone sharp. Lee looked at the dark display sphere. May I? She asked. The counselor gestured permission. Lee took a small device from her pocket. She did not show battle logs or schematics. She showed a picture. It was an old, black and white photo from Earth. It showed a broken-down truck on a dusty road. The truck's hood was open. Two men were looking at the engine. One of them was holding a wooden stick and a piece of rope. This is from our history, Lee said. A vehicle broke down, far from help. The driver did not have the correct part. So he used a stick and some rope to tie something in place. It was not correct. It was not safe. But it worked long enough to get home. She changed the picture. This one was color. It showed a flood. People were filling bags with sand. But they had run out of proper bags. They were using pillowcases, shopping bags, even their own pants tied at the legs. They did not have the right tool, Lee said softly. So they used the wrong one. Because the problem, the water, did not care about being correct. She put the device away. She looked at the circle of silent aliens. You see desperation. I see daily life. For most of human history, we did not have the perfect tool. We did not have the perfect material. We had a problem. A broken cart, a leaking roof, a sick child. And we had to fix it. With a stick. With a piece of cloth. With a prayer. We learned that the world is not a perfect kit. It is a collection of scraps. And you build your safety from those scraps. First voice, floating at the edge of the chamber, understood. He had seen it. The different hull plates. The rewired systems. It was not a war doctrine. It was a civilian doctrine. A deep, old habit of an entire species. The Busan, Lee continued, is just a truck on a cosmic road. It broke down. Its crew used sticks and rope. They used coolant lines for air. They used damage control for guns. They became each other's jobs. They were just doing what humans have always done. They were trying to get home. The old counselor leaned forward. But this adaptability, this willingness to use anything, it makes you formidable in conflict. It makes you terrifying. Lee met his gaze. Her eyes were honest. Yes, it does. The same hands that mend a fence can mend a rifle. The same mind that finds a shortcut to water can find a shortcut through a battle plan. We are not a peaceful species because we are weak. We are trying to become a peaceful species because we have seen what our strength can do. We have seen the cost. The Busan is that cost. She let the words hang. You examined our warship. The knowledge you acquired struck panic into you. Good. Let it. Let that panic be the wall that keeps us from ever needing to build another Busan. Let your fear of our wartime mind be the reason we stay in peacetime. The council was stunned. This was not a threat. It was not a boast. It was a confession. And a warning. You are offering your weakness as a shield? The sharp-voiced counselor asked. No, Li said. I am showing you our strength and asking you to help us keep it sheathed. We are asking for an alliance not out of your pity, but out of your understanding. You now understand what we are. You can try to destroy us, knowing it will cost you everything. Or you can stand with us, knowing we will use every stick and every piece of rope we have to protect you, too. She gave a small bow. The lesson is over. The choice is yours. She turned and walked out of the sphere. The doors closed behind her with a soft sigh. In the observation room overlooking the research bay, Min watched as the alien teams began to withdraw from the Busan. The scans were complete. The probes were retracted. The ship was being left alone, a dark monument in the bright bay. First Voice joined him at the window. He did not speak for a long time. He just looked at the ugly, wonderful, terrifying ship. Min, he said finally, your home. Is it full of sticks and rope? Min almost smiled. It was a faint, sad thing. Yes, in every closet, in every shed, just in case the truck breaks down. First Voice nodded. He looked from the human ship to his own perfect, gleaming vessels. He thought of the pillowcases filled with sand. He thought of the whole desperate, stubborn history of a species that refused to die. The panic was still there, but it had changed. It was no longer the fear of a weapon. It was the fear of a force of nature. And the only sane thing to do with a force of nature was not to fight it, but to understand its tides and build your house on higher ground. He looked at Min. We will need to talk, he said. About where to build. Min nodded. We have many sticks, he said. We can share.